The Situation Room was quieter than usual, despite the gravity of what had just been decided. President Donald J. Trump sat at the head of the long oak table, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The screens behind him flickered with satellite feeds over the Persian Gulf, showing cloudless skies and a string of red-ringed points, Natanz, Fordow, Iraq. These were not just nuclear sites. They were symbols, targets, and as of this morning, one of them would be struck. He had listened. To the CIA briefing, the Israeli assessment, the Pentagon's war game simulations, and finally, to his own instinct. The room had been divided. Some argued restraint, warn of consequences, apply pressure. Others, especially the Mossad liaisons, insisted that waiting meant surrendering the initiative. But Trump had already made up his mind before they even finished talking. "They've crossed the line," he said flatly. "We're going to hit them before they think they can hit us." There was no applause, only silence, and a nod from General Curtis Hayward, the new Joint Chiefs liaison, brought in after Esper's departure. He leaned forward with a quiet certainty. "We'll need 12 hours. Operation Iron Whisper is already partially mobilized." The president narrowed his eyes. "No Americans on the ground, no blowback. I want it clean. B-2 strike, no trace, no signatures," Hayward confirmed. "Maximum ambiguity." From her seat along the right side of the table, Rachel Owens, NSA's top cyber operations chief, flipped her tablet open and glanced at the data stream flowing in from CENTCOM. Her role would be pivotal. The attack wouldn't begin with bombs, but with bandwidth. Every radar station between Qom and Shiraz would be chasing ghosts by the time the B-2 Spirits entered Iranian airspace. "We'll deploy Ghost Trail across their early warning network," she said. "It'll look like an Israeli swarm coming from the northwest. They'll mobilize east while the real threat slips through from the south." Trump didn't ask for technicals. He just wanted results. "No mistakes. This doesn't start World War III. It ends something worse." Outside, Washington was spiraling through its own political maelstrom. The capital was already surrounded by protesters. Rumors of unrest were spreading through the city like brush fire, and the world was still reacting to the chaotic aftermath of the 2020 election. Few inside the West Wing knew what was unfolding in the underground corridors of the Pentagon. Fewer still understood what a strike on Iran would mean with just 2 weeks left in Trump's presidency. Yet the decision had been made, quietly, without ceremony. In an airbase in Missouri, Major David Callan stood beside one of the two B-2 Spirit bombers tasked with carrying out the mission. He had flown high-risk sorties before, Afghanistan, Syria, classified reconnaissance over North Korea, but nothing matched this. The briefing had been short. Deep penetration into Iranian airspace. 2 massive ordnance penetrators, total radio silence, and complete deniability. If they were shot down, the mission never existed. He hadn't asked why now. He already knew. Natanz wasn't just enriching uranium anymore. It was accelerating its progress toward weaponization, and according to Israeli intercepts, new generation centrifuges were nearly operational at Fordow, shielded deep beneath mountains, beyond the reach of most conventional weapons. The risk was incalculable, but the timing? Perfect. Iran was distracted. Its radar grid hadn't been upgraded in years. American cyber units had spent months mapping vulnerabilities, and Trump, unburdened by re-election, was ready to leave behind a legacy no one would forget. By nightfall, Operation Iron Whisper was fully underway. Rachel Owens worked in tandem with an elite AI-driven program codenamed LYNX, feeding false data streams into Iranian surveillance systems. The program didn't just spoof signals, it imitated flight behavior, created believable squadron chatter, and mimicked satellite reflections. It was built not to fool machines, but to fool the people watching them. Meanwhile, in Tehran, General Ashkan Darvishi of Iran's Aerospace Defense Command frowned at a sudden spike in radar activity over the northwest corridor. Israeli drones, he thought. Perhaps another provocation. He issued alert protocols but did not mobilize the full defense response. A mistake, but an understandable one. After months of bluster and no follow-through, the game had become predictable. In that moment, the real threat, two jet-black bombers, were skimming low over the Arabian Sea, invisible to every satellite, every thermal scope. Inside the cockpit, Major Callan triple-checked the payload coordinates. Target Alpha, Natanz, Target Bravo, Fordow. On his screen, a green countdown appeared, T-003945. Far above, American satellites blinked into standby. Submarines repositioned in the Gulf. Drone feeds were cut. A curtain was being drawn. At the White House, Trump walked back to the Oval Office alone. No cameras, no announcements. He poured himself a Diet Coke and stared at the darkened windows. If the mission failed, he could deny everything. If it succeeded, the world would change. But no one could say who changed it. In Tehran, Darvishi's aide walked in with a confused look. "Sir, something's odd. We just lost telemetry over Isfahan, and there's seismic activity. Could be natural, but it aligns with..." Darvishi looked up slowly, a knot tightening in his chest. "How many birds in the air right now?" "None confirmed, only radar ghosts." He stood. "This isn't Israel." In Missouri, the radio inside the B-2 cockpit crackled once, then silence again. Final approach. Targets locked. Major Callan adjusted his oxygen mask, his voice calm. "This is Ghost 1. On vector somewhere deep underground in Iran, centrifuges were spinning, unaware that the countdown had already begun." The silence was complete. No afterburner trail, no radio chatter, no detectable pulse in the skies. Major David Callan guided the B-2 Spirit deeper into Iranian airspace, the matte black aircraft slicing through the upper atmosphere like a phantom. At his side, co-pilot Captain Nina Ramirez monitored the sensor suite, scanning for even the slightest trace of enemy radar. There was nothing, just as Rachel Owens and her Lynx program had promised. The illusion was working. Below them, the city lights of Isfahan glittered faintly in the distance. But the true objective lay beyond. The Natanz nuclear facility, Iran's primary enrichment complex. Buried beneath layers of concrete and steel, it had been hardened against everything short of a nuclear blast. But not even Natanz could survive the precision of a massive ordnance penetrator delivered by a stealth bomber moving faster than sound and quieter than wind. Back in Ramstein, Rachel watched the digital theater unfold with clinical precision. Iranian radars were still chasing decoys conjured by Lynx, non-existent drones darting across their skies in orchestrated confusion. Their anti-aircraft batteries were locked in the northwest, tracking threats that didn't exist, while the real danger drifted silently over their southern border. It was like watching a magician control the eyes of a crowd while his hands did the impossible elsewhere. In Tehran, General Ashkan Darvishi's eyes were glued to a real-time readout showing anomalies near Qom. Static bursts, radar gaps. He didn't believe in ghosts, but these signatures didn't make sense. Israeli drones didn't behave this way. They didn't loop patterns or simulate squadron dispersal. Something was deliberately distorting his view of the battlefield. "Get me infrared," he barked. "Full spectrum, south quadrant." An aide complied, but the image that came through was incomplete. Patchy thermal. No elevation profile. The heat signatures, if any existed, had been masked. Darvishi wasn't certain yet, but he felt it in his bones. This wasn't a test. It was a blade, mid-swing. At Natanz, deep underground, engineers were completing a routine rotation. Enrichment levels had climbed steadily for months, inching toward weapons grade. Iranian leadership had publicly insisted their intentions were peaceful, but in these sterile halls, actions spoke louder than denials. The centrifuges had accelerated. New generation IR-9s had replaced outdated models. All signs pointed toward a breakout. No one heard the first impact. Not until the ground began to move. The MOP dropped by Callan's bomber burrowed through the earth with terrifying speed. 30,000 pounds of hardened steel and kinetic fury struck the site's western generator core, followed by a blast that rippled through the tunnel network like a shock wave inside a submarine. Emergency lights flickered, warning klaxons screamed. Centrifuge control rooms went dark. 3 minutes later, Ghost 2, the second B-2, released its payload over Fordow. Unlike Natanz, Fordow's layout was more constrained, its access shafts narrower, its backup systems vulnerable. The second bomb struck the facility's ventilation system with pinpoint precision, collapsing the exit tunnel and creating a chain reaction in the subterranean power conduits. Smoke began to rise from the mountain, not in flames, but in controlled puffs, like a volcano exhaling. Callan banked westward, low and fast. No Iranian fighter had been scrambled. No SAM site had locked on. It was as if they'd never been there at all. In Ramstein, Rachel shut down links in phases, erasing all digital traces of the false incursion. Iranian radar would recalibrate, but by the time it did, the bombers would be halfway back to Diego Garcia. Everything had gone as planned. Almost. Except for one fragment. Inside the crater left by the Fordow strike, Iranian recovery teams found an anomaly, part of a bomb casing that hadn't fully detonated. Unlike the rest of the debris, it had survived. The paint was scorched off, but embedded deep in the alloy was a faint manufacturer's imprint. American, military grade, irrefutable. General Darvishi stared at the image from his field commander. A serial code, one that could only have originated from a U.S. inventory. No other nation had access to that specific production line. He leaned back, jaw tight. It had been the United States, not Israel, not a rogue actor. Washington had struck and done so with surgical intent. In the Oval Office, President Trump received a single line of confirmation: targets neutralized. Minimal fallout. No attribution detected. He said nothing, just nodded. The goal had never been publicity. It was strategic delay. To prove a point, that no facility was truly safe and no red line could be crossed without consequence. Still, he knew it couldn't stay buried forever. Not in the age of digital leaks and independent verification, but by then, it wouldn't matter. He would be out of office. The legacy, irreversible. In Tehran, as morning prayers echoed over rooftops, state media remained quiet. The regime wasn't ready to admit what had happened, not until they could decide on a narrative. Accident, sabotage, seismic activity, each came with its own set of problems. Admitting a successful foreign strike, one that humiliated their most sacred defense sites, could destabilize more than public morale. General Darvishi paced in silence. They had been struck and never saw it coming. And worse, they had no one they could hold accountable. Not yet. The sun had barely risen over Tehran when the first satellite images were leaked. Smoke plumes rising discreetly over the mountains near Qom. Discolorations in the terrain. Power outages recorded on independent energy grids. The world was watching now, but no one had claimed responsibility, and Iran hadn't acknowledged anything beyond technical issues at Fordow and routine maintenance in Natanz. The truth was hemorrhaging through closed channels faster than the regime could plug the wounds. General Ashkan Darvishi stood alone in the subterranean war room, replaying the thermal scans again. He knew exactly what had happened. He had seen it unfold, piece by piece, but without a launch trail, without radar confirmation or visual contact, he had no weapon to wield in return. There was only a serial number, American, unmistakably, and a crater, where the mountain used to breathe. But striking back meant war. And Iran wasn't ready. Not against an enemy that could fly undetected, destroy fortified facilities with surgical accuracy, and disappear before the first alarm was sounded. The Supreme National Security Council met behind closed doors. The hardliners, furious and humiliated, demanded retaliation, missile strikes against U.S. bases in Iraq or naval targets in the Persian Gulf. Cooler voices urged caution. The upcoming transition in Washington, the possibility of rejoining the JCPOA, and the risk of regional escalation were all too volatile. General Darvishi delivered his assessment plainly. We were hit, and we didn't even know we were bleeding until the wound was open. They chose silence. In Washington, President Trump remained uncharacteristically quiet. No tweet, no press statement. The mission, for all its magnitude, remained locked under multiple layers of deniability. And yet, within the Pentagon and intelligence circles, the strike was being hailed as one of the most flawlessly executed covert operations of the modern era. A demonstration of American dominance, stealth, cyber, psychological. In Missouri, Major Callan returned to base like a ghost. No public commendation, no headlines. Debriefed in silence, his mission scrubbed from official logs. But he didn't need applause. He had seen the target, felt the tremor in the air as the bomb tore through layers of earth and concrete, and knew something irreversible had occurred. Captain Ramirez, watching the sun rise over the hangar tarmac, said softly, "It feels strange, ending something without anyone admitting it started." Rachel Owens, meanwhile, was already working on the next phase. Not another strike, but containment. The Cyber Warfare Division began scanning global networks for signs of Iranian digital retaliation. But nothing came. No malware campaigns, no retaliatory hacks. Tehran's silence was as strategic as it was unsettling. In Tel Aviv, Mossad analysts pored over the aftermath with clinical satisfaction. Their agents had long warned that Fordow and Natanz were sprinting toward weaponization. With both facilities set back by at least 2 years and their confidence shattered, Israel quietly considered the strike a shared victory, even if it had no fingerprints to prove involvement. But the silence only lasted so long. Within days, international nuclear watchdogs demanded access to the damaged sites. Iran refused. The IAEA was stonewalled. Western media picked up on inconsistencies in Iran's explanation. Investigative journalists traced seismic readings to the impact zones. Civilian satellite firms began publishing before and after comparisons. The cover was unraveling. The world didn't need an official confession. The evidence was assembling itself. The message, though unspoken, had landed. The U.S. still held the reach, the will, and the technology to act unilaterally when it deemed the stakes high enough. Even as Trump's presidency neared its chaotic final days, he had altered the calculus of nuclear brinkmanship in the Middle East. Iran, humiliated but unbroken, pivoted. Rather than retaliate with missiles, it went deeper underground, literally. Construction began near Iraq, where new caverns were being carved under mountains thicker than Fordow's. A silent arms race, beneath the earth and away from prying satellites, had begun. General Darvishi wasn't dismissed, but he understood that the damage had cost him something intangible: trust. In his final report, classified for internal use only, he wrote, "We were not attacked, we were tested, and we failed to see the test even after it ended." Back in the United States, Trump's aides discussed the mission in whispers. Some feared the long-term fallout, that it would provoke a shadow war or embolden hardliners. Others believed it had bought time, a reset of red lines. Trump himself never brought it up again, not publicly, perhaps not even privately. His attention soon shifted to transition chaos, lawsuits, and legacy battles. But somewhere, stored deep in the archives of an unnamed server, the mission log remained. Operation Iron Whisper, 2 bombers, 2 targets, 0 casualties, and the detonation that wasn't heard, but changed everything. In the end, there were no parades, no medals, no viral footage. Just the truth, sealed beneath mountains of silence.